You want to introduce?
Yep. We're welcoming back to, I believe, his second Pulpfest. Somebody who joined us for the first time last year. Had a great time. I enjoyed meeting him and talking to him, and we're delighted that he accepted our invitation to participate in our special centennial tribute to Edgar Rice Burroughs. This is Henry Franke, who happens to be the treasurer and editor of the Burroughs Bibliophiles, which is the preeminent journal and organization preserving, protecting, and defending the works of Edgar Rice Burroughs. So Henry has a very special presentation for us, titled, as you can see, Tarzan, a Hero for the Ages. And without further ado, Henry, take it away.
Has everybody read this book? Everybody? Everybody read it? I actually do recommend reading this book. Erwin Bohr just did an amazing job given the fact that he went through an entire warehouse of paperwork. Burroughs threw nothing away in his life, literally. And I've seen the files. There are thousands and thousands of pages, including almost every fan letter ever sent and copies of everything he sent out to fans. Just an example.
Use the mic.
I will sit down. I'll talk. If you can't hear me, yell. And of course, I've got to practice this machine at the same time. And where are they down here? Right. Obviously, covering 100 years of Burroughs Tarzan, and you notice as far as I link it, it's Burroughs Tarzan. We'll talk a little bit about some other versions of the hero over the years and how it frustrated Burroughs himself. But sadly, we lost Ray Bradbury this year, but Ray Bradbury was a huge fan of Burroughs, was always happy to say so, wrote the introduction to Borges' book, and you can't say it more eloquently than that as far as how he thought Burroughs affected popular culture. And in the end, Burroughs and Tarzan are popular culture. Critics have had their say and are having their say more and more all the time, but it's really how he impacted the public around the world, because in some ways he was even more popular in certain decades overseas than he was in the United States. All right, Burroughs himself had always hoped to have broken out of the pulps and gone to the slicks, but the reality is he never really did. He was a pulp writer from the start, and he had stories published till just before he died in the pulps, and of course afterwards. I think Ray Palmer himself was hoping to get someone to write new stories. I'm not sure how well he talked with the estate, but there was always this interest, and as you can imagine, the explosion of pastiches today, the Burroughs fans are writing these things forever. In fact, I contend Burroughs sometimes wrote his own pastiches. Burroughs is not the most prolific pulp writer by any means, but given everything else he was trying to do in his life, he still wrote quite a bit of stuff. And what's the most significant thing about Burroughs is there's not many pulp writers that started writing in 1912 and 1911 that could be remembered today by a large part of the public. And of course, his icon Tarzan is recognized around the world even today, which is why we're here talking about this. All right, there's a couple of famous quotes from Burroughs as to why he got into this business. He always was a storyteller. He entertained his kids. He actually did write some stuff earlier, but he was actually better at illustrating. He was a pretty decent illustrator. He did his own little cartoons and all back even when he was a cavalryman before the turn of the century. But in the end, he wanted to make some money. He was born in 1 September 1875. 36 years old when his first story was published. He had gone from job to job. He was not a failure in the traditional sense. I contend he was a very restless man. He had things he wanted to do in his life, and I think one of them was, in fact, to be a success, sometimes measured by money. But he was restless, and he was very successful at Sears Roebuck in Chicago, which is where he was born and raised. And they asked him to stay on. He simply moved on to a job that just took him down the toilet. And then after that, it took him further down the toilet. I think he was looking for something, and ironically, this is how he fell into it. We also lost Gore Vidal just not long ago. He himself had written an article in Esquire where he said he had actually gone and reread the Tarzan stories, characterized Burroughs as one of those great daydreamers who has had a lasting impact on the public. And you've heard different characterizations. Harlan Ellison, I think, said that it was Superman, Mickey Mouse, and Tarzan were three great characters. Other people said it was Sherlock Holmes, and James Bond, and Tarzan. And of course here, you've got James Bond, Mike Hammer, and Tarzan. But you keep saying Tarzan again as an iconic figure that somehow survived decades and decades in the popular consciousness, and again, overseas as well. I cannot begin. The John Carter movie, by the way, made more money by far overseas. It was the #1 movie in Russia and a number of other countries when it came out. And the same can be said of some of his books, which were just phenomenal in selling. And in some cases, Burroughs never saw a penny, like anything published in Russia. You hear a lot of people say that Burroughs was not a writer. He was not literary. He was a storyteller. I can tell anyone that can read, that millions of copies sell, people read them and read them over again. If you can write, put pen to paper, you are a writer. You're literary. And I'll let the critics decide what is what. I contend the reading publics made decisions. But daydreamer, storyteller, writer, I think is probably the right way of characterizing Burroughs. And he had one phenomenal flash one day, and he spent the rest of his life explaining where that flash came from. That's called Tarzan Eves. Please bear with me. When he started writing, he did Princess of Mars in 1911. He started Tarzan the Apes 1 December of 1911, finished 14 May 1912, and he dated it, he put the end at 10:24 p.m. I tell you, the record keeper. 1912, Under the Moons of Mars, 1912, Tarzan the Apes, 13 was Gods of Mars, Return of Tarzan, The Cave Girl, A Man Without a Soul, Warlord of Mars, 1914, saw Outlaw of Torn, which is the second book that almost caused him to stop writing before he did Tarzan. At the Earth's Core, The Mucker, Mad King, The Eternal Lover, The Beast of Tarzan, 1915, Sweetheart Primeval, Barney Custer, Pellucidar, Son of Tarzan, The Man-Eater. Beyond 30 was 1916, The Return of the Mucker, Jungle Tales of Tarzan, Jewels of Opar, Thuvia Maid of Mars, The Girls from Pharaohs, Aladdin the Lion, back to 1917, The Caveman, 1917. Land of Time Forgot, People of Time Forgot, Out of Time's Abyss, His Royal Highness the Writer, and Oakdale Affair started in 1918. So he may not have been Lester Dent, but he created 3 of his 4 major series in 24 months, and created what's considered some of his most interesting fiction, the Caspak trilogy. So he was on fire. And meanwhile, he was driving around the country when there was no roads, visiting California, deciding where he was going to live after he started making some real money. And he was running his own business without an agent, as we'll talk about. It's amazing what the man did himself. But this is it. His first novel, we'll talk about it, I'm sure, tomorrow at the panel, Under the Moons of Mars, eventually called The Princess of Mars. Metcalf was his editor of the whole story. He sent half the story in. Metcalf said it was good enough to, do the second half. Not a very normal thing to do, but like I said, Burroughs learned to write on the fly. Metcalf wanted to take him a different direction, said, why don't you write something historical, Outlaw Torn. Burroughs hated spending time that wasn't turning the money, and Outlaw Torn got 3 rewrites, and he almost stopped. That's when Metcalf said, don't give up, please. But when Burroughs was talking about this wild story idea he had for this child that's raised by apes, Metcalf really took to it quickly, and the more he saw of it, the more he loved it. And as you noticed, something not done that often. It was both the cover and a full novelization in one issue. One reason this is probably the most expensive pulp nowadays. It's interesting to note that Under the Moons of Mars never had a single cover, and it was in 7 installments, and never had any illustrations except the header. So Tarzan the Apes really excited Metcalf. You need to give Metcalf credit. A lot of what Burroughs did his first few novels, you can thank Metcalf for, because he really helped guide Burroughs, who was learning to write novels while he was publishing. You can actually see that little red arrow on the left-hand side. At first he was going to call him Xantar, he was going to call him Tubal Zahn, and then he said Tarzan. He was going to call him Lord Bloomstoke. Right at the bottom, just a few lines later, you see crossed it out and put Greystoke. But pretty important. Again, people always ask Burroughs how he came up with these ideas, and he said, I think probably the most important thing he ever did was coming up with the name, Tarzan. It sounds right, it literally does grab the brain, and Burroughs himself is known for the way he come up with names of beasts and places and characters, and sometimes he spent quite a bit of time keeping up with these things, and he always kept a character list typed up. If it had been Zontar, we wouldn't be here today. All right, is Tarzan the Apes literature? The first character in Under the Moons of Mars is Edgar S. Burroughs. The first character in Tarzan the Apes is Edgar S. Burroughs. When he says the I, it's not some unknown thing. It's Burroughs. You can ask someday if Burroughs thought himself more Tarzan or more John Carter. I think he thought himself more John Carter. Tarzan was a thought experiment for him, as we'll talk about in a minute. This is also the only major series that Burroughs did that the I wasn't the character himself. In the framing sequence, because he loved framing, because that's what he did in those days. It was the I then, and then of course he passed the manuscript, and then you had the second I, which was the character. Tarzan was always third person. It allowed the ability to explore the man's mind and actions in a different way than if he'd been trying to explain things himself. And it really kind of hard to explain his ability to think like a human being his first few years before he learned English or any language of humanity. Tarzan the Apes really is, to me, the great novel of Burroughs because it is truly a character study. He actually tries to explain what obviously is basically impossible to happen to a human being, and it sounds realistic. He actually grows this human being into adulthood, and I think it's a pretty impressive piece of work in that respect. He rises from the apes. He learns to teach himself to read. He learns language. He learns several languages, in fact. French, ironically. He reads English, speaks French, with an ape accent, of course. And of course, he's already learned the language of the apes, which is another thing that's considered Burroughs' great achievements, is this idea of putting enough words out that you start thinking and feeling from the standpoint of these non-human characters. To me, you really need to read both novels, Tarzan the Apes, Return of Tarzan. Return of Tarzan, in many ways, is truly an amazing novel. And what he did with Tarzan, remember, he takes him into civilization. He takes him to the United States. He's in Paris. In Return of Tarzan, he takes him right back down. He's in Paris. He's actually he's smoking. He's drinking. Bad things happen. He reverts to his original nature. The Brits call him in, ask him to be a spy. He goes to North Africa, falls into the Arabs, decides to travel south. He falls in with the Waziri. He leads a tribe of blacks. He falls into the apes. He becomes an ape. And then he discovers Opar and law. I mean, it's really an astounding book, and some Burroughs fans think it's probably the best of the series. And really, skip Beasts. Read those first two novels. Beast being the third. And of course, he married, and the person who marries Jane is Jane's father, who's also an ordained minister. When you read any Burroughs novel, you're understanding what Burroughs thought about life. And in many ways, he was pretty much ahead of his time. He strong believer in Darwinism, in genetics. He believed that apes were in fact progenitors of mankind. He really got into this stuff, and he really believed at a time when it was still not, the way people thought about life. Also, he was pretty much not very impressed by organized religion. Something else that he was pretty blatant about in his novels, and again, surprising when these books were first coming out. But Tarzan was something important to him. This was a nature versus nurture thought experiment. As you'll see, he thought that genetics did play a part in people's nobility as individuals. But Burroughs was also one of those guys that believed in nature and getting out, being physical. The great thing he gives humanity is the intellect. Tarzan had humor. He played pranks. He was curious. He wanted to learn more. That put him above all else. That part of humanity is what made him the king of the apes. And the ability to use tools, luckily. But Tarzan was a very interesting character in the fact that he did meld certain ideas and took a lot of Burroughs' own thoughts about environment, civilization, and its shortfalls, nature and the nobility of nature and of animals. I'll let you take a look at that because I think it's interesting. As the years went by, he tried to explain Tarzan. And, you know, this is fiction. I'm trying to entertain you. Let's not take this too seriously. Let's see if I can find this. He said, when I first conceived this story, this is what I started out to be. But the more I thought about it, the more convinced I became that the resultant adult would be the most disagreeable person to have about the house. He would probably have BO, pink toothbrush, halitosis, and athlete's foot, plus the most abominable disposition. So I decided not to be honest, but to draw a character people could admire. So, it's not art, it's entertainment. Now, Burroughs had one great desire when he thought a writer was someone who published in hardcover. A pulp was a pulp, and it certainly got him money. But hardcover publication was what he wanted, and he could not get anyone to pick up the book. But in the meantime, he sold this thing to newspapers. A lot of people don't realize how many novels were serialized for many, many years in newspapers. And he got the big New York papers to serialize, and it was, it caught on like wildfire. It was serialized all over the country, as many of his novels were, by the way. In this case, these are a Fort Wayne paper, happened to be my hometown back in 1913, but these things this was already being published in New York in 1912, and you could show the publishers the sales figures. And by the way, he managed all these papers and all the money coming in all by himself. Couldn't help himself. And son of a gun, after multiple rejections, including from McClure picked him up, published in early 1914, and Burroughs, in his mind at least, had arrived. He was a writer. McClure did the first editions. Eventually we got to St. John. How can you beat having St. John doing covers and interior art in your books? And these are just the first ones, and again, you remember how rapidly these were being written and published. Now, in reality, though, I think very few people would know Burroughs today if it weren't for the movies. The irony, of course, is that eventually the Tarzan the movies was not in any way Burroughs' Tarzan. It just irked him like you can't imagine. But the first movie was really another story, but as best they could for the time they had. And of course, I'll let Ed talk about the movies. But Burroughs got so unhappy about how the Tarzan started being turned into something simplistic that around 1931 or 32 he started his own company with some other folk called Burroughs Tarzan Pictures. And they actually did do some movies which went back to the original Tarzan. In fact, I think this is one of them, right here. All right, you just saw, he hated cities. He didn't like crowds. He was looking for a ranch. He really had a lot of money by 1918, 1919. He was living in Oak Park, nice area even then, outside of Chicago. And he bought from the former publisher of the Los Angeles Times. He bought this ranch. He called it Tarzan Ranch. And like all things, he couldn't help himself. He eventually pushed hard to get this thing recognized as a real place. And they had a post office, you can see on the left-hand side. And of course today there is a Tarzan. And you'd be amazed how many residents don't know his name for Tarzan. As I found a few years ago just driving back with a resident from the airport, from Lax. All right, Burroughs was about money and about business. And while he kept making odd decisions all his life, even with business, he was very good about his own intellectual property. He worked very hard to get the original rights for the first few novels that he had written back 100%. After that, though, he never let any rights go. Even these first ones, he made sure it was only first zero rights that he had lost. Trademarked, something that was, by the way, that's why I put the trademark on Tarzan. I got to help the Burroughs Corporation protect their property. He really worked hard to be sure that he had control of this. And one way he made sure he had control was he incorporated himself. So his family was taken care of when he was gone. And Europe Incorporated, of course, still exists today. Now, one thing about Tarzan especially was whenever a new media really started to make it big, Tarzan was out in the forefront. You know, when newspaper strips, adventure strips were coming out for the first time. There were Tarzan, when radio serials were coming out that were syndicated. There was Tarzan. Well, when you had comic books, there was Tarzan. When you had, you can keep going on. The 1918 movie was one of the first 10 movies to make $1 million, considered one of the top movies of the silent era. It was playing everywhere across the country when often that wasn't done for more than a day or two. It played for weeks and months in some theaters. I mean, it was something different. And it's also, I think, the first major film, they say it was filmed on location. Also, for the very first films to have African Americans play African Americans. Before that, most movies, they actually made African Americans put blackface on, because it's just what you did. All right, Burroughs was a romance writer. I don't know how to explain it better, but when you see the blur for Prince of Mars, it says interplanetary romance. Remember Tarzan the Apes, Romance in the Jungle? People don't realize he was a romance writer. All of his novels were love stories. Every one of them. They kind of went on the same, like any love story. Man doesn't realize he had the girl doesn't know how to tell a guy that he can have her if he wants. Well, name your approach. Eventually they figured it all out. The problem was he married Jane off in the second novel. Now what do you do? Where's the romance? Where's the fun? Where are people discovering each other? Where's the confusion, the misunderstandings? He blew it. And he didn't expect to write more than a couple of Tarzan novels anyway. So when these things kept building up, and one reason he wrote Jungle Tales of Tarzan, he got away from, it's probably the only time there wasn't a romance involved, except in one of the short stories. He was trying to figure out what to do now. And one of the things he was going to do was, in Tarzan the Untamed, he was simply, or Tarzan the Terrible, simply going to kill off Jane. And in fact, Jane was killed. While the story was being serialized, they realized it was probably a bad idea. And so they brought Jane back. But he actually had a love interest for Tarzan in them, which he gave to another character he introduced. You all know that Sherlock Holmes hated, A. Conan Doyle hated Tarzan. Sherlock Holmes, it ruled his life. He thought he was a historical novel writer. Sherlock Holmes was just an accident. Please move on. So he killed off Sherlock Holmes. And then, of course, the public was going to crucify me to bring him back. That's how he made real money. What are you going to do? Well, Burroughs was in the same situation. He literally would, he was very good at plotting his books, but he would call secretary in like he was going to the dentist as the novels kept going on. There was a love-hate in many ways. He protected the property. He didn't want it to be ruined or damaged by other people's interpretations, but he knew but the money was good. And there you are. And yet some of those novels were amazingly good anyway. So I think he just liked to write good stories as best he could. All right, back in 1929, they were hoping to get St. John to picturize the novel. It actually was a story strip. He simply took text, summarized, abridged, and then pictures. Foster was so good at this that, as you know, he eventually picked up the strip itself. Eventually went to Vern Hogarth. But that turned into what some people think maybe one of the first graphic novels. I think they were doing the same thing with Annie with Little Orphan Annie, so I'm not sure you can make that claim. But it certainly was the first Tarzan graphic novel. Newspaper strips followed. Some people say that the very first adventure strips were, I think, Flash Gordon. And Tarzan published the same day. I've heard some stories that they may have had them done in England a couple of weeks earlier. Maybe Tarzan was the first. But those are still being printed today, although, of course, the new stories. In fact, there's going to be an online Tarzan written by Roy Thomas and drawn by Tom Greenberg. This will probably premiere in a few weeks. And then, of course, eventually you got the real comics. Tarzan the radio. People sometimes approach Burroughs, and he loved the ideas. Someone approached him with this. Burroughs thought radio was hot stuff. They actually ran these things. It was his son-in-law and his daughter played Tarzan and Jane. The son-in-law, in fact, played Tarzan in, I think it was the last silent movie, Tarzan the Golden Lion. Jim Pierce was his name. He spent the rest of his life trying to find a copy of the film, died never seeing. They thought it was lost. They found all but the last chapter reel in France about 10 or so years ago. But this was quite successful, lasted almost 2 years. They did another series in 1951. Burroughs was so happy with the way this stuff was going, he wanted control. Burroughs always wanted control. One reason was no middleman to take money. He wanted all the money. He didn't know what he was doing sometimes, but he wanted the money. He actually produced a couple of 13-chapter serials, one of which did air, one of which only has been put out about 15 years ago when they discovered it. People always think of Tarzan and Burroughs as a writer for boys and girls. Well, Burroughs was an adult fiction writer. He never thought of himself as writing for kids. And of course, any child, any boy or girl that saw the Pulps would read, and many of them loved his stuff. But he wrote for adults. This is the only time he really wrote for children. And it didn't do very well, and that was it. You rarely hear these things talked about as part of the canon. You notice on the bottom right that over 1,000 pastiches were written of Tarzan, the character, in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s in Israel. He was considered literally a Jew. They treated him that way. He thought, he was someone that took care of the oppressed. And Burroughs Incorporated wasn't even aware of these things were being written for 30 years and made no money at all. But there were authorized publications. There were newspaper serials. Iceland itself, one of the very first newspaper serials overseas was in Iceland, of all places. In fact, that Tarzan up there in upper left is from Iceland. You can see the Japanese novels. The one in the upper right is pastiche. It's not actually a translation. There were about 100 plus pastiches of Tarzan in South America. And we can go on and on. The one on the left-hand side, not too long ago, they had a major exhibition of Tarzan in Paris. It lasted a year. Bigelow books, kind of an interesting component of the pulp business. Obviously, quite a few of these things, some picturized off the movies, some picturized off of his novels. And his own son did some of these, some of the artwork. We could probably fill an entire book of all the things that Burroughs saw just in his lifetime sold that had involved Tarzan making money. So he did try what amounted to a Boy Scout, Girl Scout kind of organization called the Tarzan Clans America. It didn't really take off. Signal Oil, on the other hand, had their first Tarzan club, as you can see there. They even had enough people that they could march them around, and there were thousands of people that were members of this club. Now it's just off the oil. Signal Oil actually sponsored the Tarzan series, the first ones in the early 30s. Very first Tarzan original story, 1947. Burroughs' son could have gotten it, didn't make the cut. Someone else took the artwork, and of course did the artwork for like 25 more years. And that's on the upper left-hand side. Many publishers tried his hand, and Tarzan, some very great artists like Russ Manning and Joe Kubert, of course, have done it. This is the bane of collecting because you can fill a house. Burroughs passed away in 1950. In fact, he couldn't even find a place in Tarzana. He had been slowly subdivided over years, and by the time he had sold every lot, there was nothing for him to live in when he came back from the war. And he actually did live overseas for many years in Hawaii, and then was a correspondent for Pacific Theater. His company kind of just let things lax off. The big boom that started in the early 60s, partly because of the librarians saying they weren't married, made national news. Tarzan and Jane Living in Sin. I'm taking all the books out of the library. People thought that the copyrights hadn't been renewed. There was a flurry of activity to start publishing. In the meantime, Canaveral Press had actually talked with the family, and we're doing new stories that had never been published before. As you see there, Tarzan the Madman. That was actually the first edition in 64, 65. And the boom started. And what I can't stress enough is Burroughs only wrote so many of these books. Well, he really caught on in the mid-60s, and it changed the face of paperback publishing for the 1960s. People, I contend that one reason Conan and a lot of other characters and writers were brought back in the 60s because the public wanted more of these stories. And there only were 24 Tarzan and 11 Mars, and they wanted more. I mean, there was a time, I think 10% of all paperbacks being sold for a couple of years were Burroughs books. Meanwhile, television, over the years, it's hard to believe we're still seeing TV being done. Ron Ely's finally coming out and talking and going to the major events. In fact, he's at an event up in Mid-Atlantic right now. So, this, of course, got a whole new generation going between the books. In television, you can't discount how important it was that those Weissman movies were being replayed in the 50s and 60s on TV. And then you had the Jock Mahoney's and Gordon Scott's within later series. One thing you saw with the Gordon Scotts and the Mike Henrys was Tarzan started becoming Burroughs Tarzan again in the movies. It wasn't, monosyllabic and just not what Burroughs wanted Tarzan to be. So ironically, the TV and the later movies started being Burroughs' Tarzan again. So the great rift kind of closing the gap. But still, in the end, who doesn't love Weissmuller, right? All right, Burroughs, again, he was an adventurer. The reason you see a lot of the martial in his story, especially his Mars novels, was, first thing, that makes for good writing, as we all know. In science fiction, we see it all the time. But he had an idea of what war was like that many people did in his generation before World War I. That was romantic. He did try his time in the Army. He tried things. He got out. He did things. His cow punching, I think he was 17 years old. You see him up the left-hand side. He learned to fly in his 50s. He actually tried to invest in a new aircraft motor. Got his sons to learn to fly, at least one of them. He lived a rich life as far as living his own philosophy by getting out at Tarzan Ranch. He rode every single morning around 6 to get up and took the horse out. So he actually lived his philosophy in that sense. He had heart problems. He probably had a heart attack coming back toward the end of his time as a correspondent. That's in the uniform in the theater. It's very interesting to note that Tarzan and the Foreign Legion, the last book that was published in his lifetime, was a little more realistic about war. I mean, a couple of major characters died just trying to escape in the last few pages. He actually had seen this theater. The Tarzan Foreign Legion was in Sumatra. And I think you start seeing a little bit more reality about what war is really like just toward his life. And unfortunately, I think that his time over there took its toll on him, and primary reason that he died at 74 years of age. All right, the thing about, you can't get Burroughs and Tarzan completely separated. Again, if it weren't for Tarzan, no one would really probably think about Burroughs except guys collecting pulps from the old days. Biography started coming out, I showed you the big one. More came out since then. Critical assessments of Burroughs and Tarzan, for example, you see there, Holtzmark's Tarzan Tradition. It said that classic training that Burroughs had can actually show in his writing that he actually understood writing about the lost hero and the heroic quest and all that, and applied what he learned in Greek and Latin in those. Ironically, things are heating up again thanks to the Centennial. Probably didn't hurt. Burroughs of states allowed authorized new novels. Fritz Leiber was the last guy actually allowed to write a Tarzan novel, considered part of the canon. But there's now a new series going on for young adults. Robin Maxwell, who normally writes historical fiction, you've seen a few more days here. The novel, the Tarzan story from her point of view, really is a rewrite, try to be more realistic. The Commander of Stamp for Burroughs, with Tarzan, of course, being featured. It will be issued next Friday in Tarzana. 3 Centennial-like books are coming out just in Tarzan. One, Egan's just came out. The one by Scott Tracy Griffin will be out in a few more weeks. And there's another one I'd show there that's going to be out in next year. So, Bridgewater College is going to have a conference, literary conference on him in a couple months. Just had a Tarzan Festival, highlighting the fact that that's actually where Morgan City was where that filming was done after that you saw with the very first movie. Online, the John Carter Files, I think has had 2 million hits now, which makes my little Burroughs Bibliophiles Facebook page look pretty sad. But there is a Burroughs Bibliophiles Facebook page, and of course a website. All right, it's hard to imagine when the Burroughs novel, the resurgence started in 61, 62, 63, Burroughs had been dead a little over 10 years. It's now been 62. The characters come and went and come again. It's very interesting. There's going to be 2 new Tarzan movies out next year. One's a motion capture animated film being done in Germany, and one's being done live action U.S. I'll believe that one when I see it. But it's it's hard to imagine. We're in the 2nd century now of Tarzan. And I hope I didn't bore you all. There's obviously a lot more we can say, and there's probably people in this room that know a lot more about this than I do, and one of them is about to speak right now.
Let's thank Henry very much.
450 copies of past issues of the Burroughs Bulletin, which are Tarzan themes, which should be available. They did make the registration packet. They should be out for people to pick up. Membership forms, all this stuff. Love to have you join if you aren't ready.
And Henry will be joining us tomorrow for another one of our Tarzan panels. I also want to thank him very much for getting us back on schedule. So I'll give you just a couple minutes, and then I'll start the final presentation of the evening, which will follow with some motion picture entertainment. And I will condense this all so we can get to bed at a reasonable hour.